Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, this evening to the eighth meeting for No to NATO, No to War. We appreciate you joining us. We have a panel discussion this evening, three excellent speakers, and we'll be covering the general theme of tonight is going to be uh, Western war propaganda and media deception. Now, this is a multi-layered topic, and it takes many forms. We're going to delve into a lot of interesting areas in here. Obviously, we're going to be focusing on the current conflict in Ukraine and also how this is being framed in the West. And we'll also bring in other areas of propaganda and analysis regarding Syria, Afghanistan as well, other theaters of war, Western theaters of war, other proxy wars. But there's quite a lot to cover on the issue of Ukraine and what we've seen unfold in the last almost is going on 2 years very soon, but the last 18 months mainly. Now, we've got a multidisciplinary panel tonight. We'll be joined by former British ambassador to Syria and Bahrain, Peter Ford, and also we're going to be joined by Dr. Lucy Morgan Edwards. She's a journalist and an author with extensive experience on the ground in Afghanistan, and also independent journalist from France, Freddie Ponton, is going to be joining us as well. So with these three speakers, I think we're going to really be able to see a lot of different facets and get a lot of insight into this really important topic. Because when we're talking about this current conflict, this is totally unique. This is unprecedented. If you look back at history in terms of a pure proxy war, this really is the greatest example of a proxy war in modern history that we've ever seen before. And so much of it depends on narrative management. This is a really important area. And if you look at how, particularly the United States, Britain, and Western Europe, how they're mobilizing so many of their state resources in terms of censorship, in terms of policing speech on social media platforms. We'll talk about the Digital Services Act in the EU, because this is also going to play into this. But in the UK, there's similar legislation also in the United States. And what we learned from the Twitter files that were released over the last 8 or 9 months after the ownership changed hands at Twitter, we saw the direct engagement of government agencies with big tech. So when we talk about propaganda, there's a whole new dimension to this now. For propaganda 1.0 was, you could say, the Operation Mockingbird style propaganda that was usually managed by intelligence agencies in the Five Eyes countries, talking about the CIA as an example, whereby all that was required was to plant certain people or friendly editors or friendly journalists, some on the payroll, some not, or actual intelligence operatives in key producer positions in broadcast television, for instance, or in editorial positions. And this is well documented. There's been a number of very good scholarly works on this topic, especially during the Cold War. But that's all that's required in that kind of propaganda 1.0, which was to control the main outlets, the main outlets in print, broadcast, and also in magazines as well. These were the influencers. And we're talking mainly about the post-World War II, latter half of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, right through the Iraq War. And so that's 1.0. 2.0 is much more dynamic because it involves, at the same time, we have propaganda, which is being disseminated through mainstream media, but also through news feeds on social media, through various online journals. But we also have the censorship aspect. So this is this is the new bookend to propaganda 1.0. And you could probably put this under the heading of fifth generation warfare, hybrid warfare, what some would call total warfare. So, as a member of the public, we've got a lot more to consider. We, like it or not, know it or not, we're involved in information warfare on a minute-by-minute basis. If you use Twitter X, or you use any of the meta platforms like Facebook or Instagram, even LinkedIn, but definitely YouTube and Google as a search engine. The information space has been weaponized. This is no longer a point to debate. We have the receipts for this now. That's the reality of the information space we're in right now. So when it comes to the narrative management of Ukraine as a proxy war, the job of manufacturing consent, to borrow Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman's seminal work in manufacturing consent, that process is taking place on a minute to minute basis now. Managing the narrative, managing this proxy war. What is the main reason why our governments, why our militaries, why our intelligence services in the West need to manufacture consent? They need the public's support for the policies, for the funding for the United States. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars at a time when governments are cutting back, implementing somewhat austerity policies in some places, where there's not enough money to go to provide aid and financial support for the victims of, for instance, the recent fires in Maui in Hawaii. The government could only manage $700 per resident, but for a country like Ukraine, it's a blank checkbook. Hundreds of billions have been flowing there, and more money will continue to flow there. So this is one of the main functions of propaganda in the context of Ukraine. But there's also a number of other interesting concepts that narrowing the framing of the discussion. And if you look at some of the strap lines, the tropes, if you will, there's been a big effort by the Western governments and by mainstream media, by the intelligence services, to frame this conflict in Ukraine as an unprovoked war. You see this term everywhere. Even when you look at the defense intelligence releases from Britain, it'll be a strap line right at the top: in Putin's unprovoked war of aggression, or something like this. There is this need to constantly reiterate this talking point. And you really should get suspicious when you see so much effort in the framing of how to frame this. And they're really concerned that the public needs to look at it as an unprovoked war, a defensive war by Ukraine, Putin's war of choice. You probably heard all of these things before. They're on heavy rotation right across the Western mainstream media. And then this is then coupled with Ukraine is winning. We've been told this. That's constantly being repeated. Ukraine is winning. The Russians are taking heavy casualties. The Russians are low on supplies. They're fighting with shovels. It's a bumbling, ham-fisted effort by the Russian military, and they're on the verge of absolute collapse. And Ukraine is constantly on the verge of winning. This has been the narrative management over the last 18 months, and it's been constant. And then this is followed by, major sort of campaigns like Ukraine's counteroffensive, the spring counteroffensive. It's coming, and this is going to be a big game changer. And then that turned to a summer counteroffensive, and now it's a winter. Now they're talking about, well, they'll have to put it on pause until the spring of 2024. This much vaunted counteroffensive. What is all this for? It doesn't have really any connection with what's really happening on the ground. But what is this other than it's political speak? It's designed to fulfill a number of key functions. One of them is to keep funding flowing, to keep public support for an increasingly, what looks like an increasingly unpopular proxy war. If you look at polling and you look at how the press is now reacting to this after 18 months. But it's also to keep the weapons flowing, because there's a business component to this. That's a big part of this Ukrainian story, is liquidating old weapon stocks from Eastern European countries that are new NATO members, old Soviet weapon stocks. And Ukraine has become a type of a clearinghouse for secondhand military equipment or older military equipment. And the logic, the master plan behind this will be to backfill all of this military equipment and remilitarize Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and really right across the entire NATO sphere. And all of this requires a constant stream of propaganda, even though the West, as they seem to be determined to bring Russia to its knees in Ukraine, to create another Afghanistan, like the Soviets suffered in the 1980s, or to bankrupt the Russian Empire, like we did during the Cold War when we won the Cold War, or so the narrative goes. And so this is all very important to kind of keep this campaign going for an indefinite period of time. This could be a long, protracted, frozen conflict. We don't know exactly how it's going to end up, but we do know that there has just been an unbelievable tsunami of propaganda, the likes of which we have never seen. Never have we seen in the West the effort to try to create so much buy-in for a war. Now, we saw this with the Iraq War, that's for sure, but that's because the West was directly involved. The United States and Britain were front-running that war. This is to buy in for somebody else's war, where we are not going to sacrifice any soldiers ourselves, not officially anyway, although there are special forces on the ground in Ukraine, despite guarantees and declarations by the White House that there's not. Of course, there is. But officially, we're not willing to sacrifice any troops, but we're expecting that Ukraine will sacrifice an unlimited amount of troops in this effort to bring Russia to its knees. This is an extraordinary situation in history, and it really requires a really cold, analytical look at what is happening. And we can draw from lessons of the past, and that's for sure. And I think our speakers tonight are going to be able to contribute a lot along those lines. And I want to welcome to the stage our first speaker is the former British ambassador to Syria and Bahrain. He is also a seasoned international affairs analyst, and also I've had the pleasure of talking to him many times before, and also recently speaking together in the UK. Peter Ford is joining us. Hi, Peter. How are you?
Thank you, Patrick. Where to begin? Well, a good starting point might be the Iraq war and the conclusions that the promoters of that war, the military adventurers who took the West, or much of the West, into that war, the conclusions they drew, because it ended badly all round. Militarily, it was a mess. Public opinion at home was lost, and it was perceived as basically a failure, and public inquiries were held, at least in Britain. Well, the powers that be drew two conclusions, not the obvious conclusion that you or I, or anyone with two brain cells to rub together, would draw, namely that it's a stupid idea to go marching into somebody else's faraway country on an absurd pretext. No, the conclusions they drew were that A, you don't put your own boots on the ground, you do it all through proxies. They were only able to do it partly through proxies in Iraq. They were hoping to make more use of the Shia, but that didn't work out very well. And secondly, to put a lot more effort into propaganda. Not propaganda directed against the other side. No, let us not be so naive. Propaganda directed at our side. Propaganda aimed at keeping domestic public opinion on side. So these were the two main conclusions that were drawn. And few years afterwards, they were put into operation in Syria. I observed this from close up as a former ambassador to Syria, and was on the receiving end of some of it. First, the Western powers used proxies. We don't need to go into much detail about that here, but they funded and trained and guided jihadi militias and Kurdish separatist groups, and they avoided putting boots on the ground or having much direct involvement, although they did to some extent carry out bombing. But the propaganda effort was a lot more skillful than it was with Iraq. First of all, anybody with a dissident opinion was excluded. Let's never forget this, that the biggest part of the battle is not to let the other side have a say, to exclude them from the public discourse. We've seen that in spades over Ukraine, but it was also the case over Syria. I had my little 15 minutes of fame. Somehow I got through the net for a couple of months when Syria was very hot and they couldn't find talking heads. But they quickly cottoned on and excluded me, the same as every other dissident voice about Syria. But that's a big part of the battle, to stop anybody else having a say. And in the case of Ukraine, to say that we're defending Western values and then to suppress freedom of speech, it's a joke. If it wasn't so serious, it would be a joke that they can close down RT, the Russian TV station, very informative, that they can exclude Press TV, also very well informed, always have an interesting standpoint. It closed down these two main sources of alternative views from outside the Western palisade, shows how very much afraid the powers that be are of dissident voices getting through and disrupting domestic public opinion. So in going back to Syria for a moment, one technique that was used was to train up what they called citizen journalists, that is locals on the spot, operating behind the lines, as it were, who would fabricate and were trained, very deliberately trained, to fabricate stories about chemical bombing atrocities and other atrocities. Now, interestingly, this technique has not been used, or not used very much at all, in Ukraine. And I think that's probably because it's not been necessary. Such has been their total control over media coverage that they haven't needed to resort to citizen journalists. The mainstream media themselves are happy to play the role of citizen journalists, even without being directly paid by governments or the CIA or SIS. And also, I suspect, because citizen journalists can actually backfire if you're not careful. Stories in Syria, they were very effective in dragging the Western powers into bombing operations against Syria, but they were not allowed to be so effective that we put boots on the ground. And this has been the fear, I think, in Ukraine, that if the Ukrainian PSYOPs people had been allowed to get away with the same kind of stories about chemical attacks that we saw in Syria, that the West would be dragged in willy-nilly. and the Pentagon, who I have to say, it goes against the grain, but they've sometimes behaved, unlike the British, like the adults in the room. I guess because they would be the ones who would have to act if indeed there were plausible stories of Russian use of chemical weapons, and this public opinion would demand direct involvement. This has not been allowed to happen. There are guardrails in Ukraine, and so for the last 2 years, we've been witnesses to the ramping up of this media narrative control operation. Nobody else has been allowed any kind of foothold anywhere in the mainstream media, except in the United States. There is far more diversity of opinion in the United States. At least there's someone like Tucker Carlson, even though he's been defenestrated from his previous channel, he's still seen perhaps in greater numbers than before, thanks to the wonders of modern media communications. But in Britain, there is nobody remotely comparable to Tucker Carlson in terms of access to domestic opinion. And that's why we are where we are, with Britain the most jingoistic of all the Western powers involved. It's why we don't have a peace camp. There is no constituency. This is another long story why actually there's no peace camp, and it's basically because the Labour Party ceased being a party of opposition and just became part of the Uni Party, which takes turns in governing this country, and they've now become even more Russophobic, if that were possible, than the Tories. So here we are with no voice except your own and a few others, and it's extremely difficult to make any headway.
One thing I wanted to ask you about, Peter, and I know you've commented on this previously about Syria and also about Ukraine. This obsession with controlling the narrative, winning the virtual war, winning the PR war. In both cases, in fact, we could extend this to Iraq and Afghanistan. This obsession by the state, its organs, the media, all in lockstep, and clearly in the West, we're winning the propaganda war. But Peter, is it translating to a win on the ground?
No, but that's not the point. The point is just to appear to be winning in the eyes of domestic opinion. And it must be accepted, I think, Patrick, regretfully, that it has been very successful in these terms. Public opinion remains solidly behind Western, in Britain anyway, different in America, and a little bit different in Germany. But here in Britain, it's been enormously successful. It's the one issue, Ukraine, where the Tories are seen to be acting in accordance with popular wishes and taking a strong, prominent role. And the politicians are perfectly happy with that. They don't care how many Ukrainians are dying. They don't care that Russia has not been humbled. They don't care that the Russian economy is growing at over 2%, while our own is barely growing at all, because the media are not allowed to point this out. The media are very happy, in fact, to keep trotting out the alibi for our high inflation rates here. It's all down to Putin. Where would they be without that alibi? So the techniques are successful in terms of their actual real unstated objectives.
It's almost, Peter, like there's a Soviet-like pressure to absolutely conform to a single party line, but this is so detached from the actual operation on the ground. It seems to me, Peter, like it's a recipe for disaster if you look back in history. But your final thoughts on that?
Well, it doesn't work in the rest of the world. Maybe you want to expand on this later, but just very briefly, the last week's BRICS gathering showed that most of the rest of the world doesn't buy the propaganda. They don't want to take sides. In fact, they're rather sympathetic to Russia, and they will, most of the developing and the most promising economically countries now, Brazil, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, they don't want to be dragged in and are ready to defy the West. In fact, the behavior of the West in terms of propaganda has been a turnoff for the rest of the world. They just don't buy it. They see through it. They've been on the receiving end of it, so they don't buy it.
It's very extraordinary, and especially with what's happening in Africa right now. Europe's southern neighborhood, as they sometimes call it, they are seeing right through it. It's very clear, and it's very interesting. This period of history right now. Peter Ford, we'll come back to you with more questions and comments in a bit, but I want to go right now to Dr. Lucy Morgan Edwards, another one of our panelists. Lucy is an author. She's also a journalist and has done a lot of great work as well with a lot of great organizations like the Organization for Propaganda Studies, and her colleagues we've talked to before as well, Dr. Piers Robinson and others. But welcome to the program, Lucy. And you have extensive on-the-ground experience, especially in Afghanistan, within a NATO environment, let's say, information environment, geopolitical environment. On this topic tonight, I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are.
Yes, thanks for having me on, Patrick. A very important topic, obviously. Yes, when I was initially in Afghanistan, I was working for various NGOs, working on elections as an observer. And then I started work as a freelance journalist, largely because I was pretty disgusted by what I saw occur at the emergency lawyer Jirga, which was supposed to be the beginning of the democratization process for Afghanistan, but in fact turned out to be where the West really stabbed the Afghans in the back in respect of Afghan civil society, and manipulated the process so that they were really continuing to support the Northern Alliance over the Taliban, but excluding other elements of legitimate civil society, other Afghan power brokers, and so on. And that was in the spring of 2002. But I first went to the region in 1999 and started working there a year before 9/11 in Kandahar and Herat. I didn't go to Kabul at that stage. I was working for an NGO that was linked to the UN. It was called ACTED, and worked for UN Habitat doing urban development. But later on, after 9/11, so I did a little freelance journalism at that stage, and I saw the whole situation with the Taliban, how people saw them as bringing stability and so on. My colleagues in Kandahar were quite supportive of them, in fact, and some of my colleagues were, of course, Talibs. Then, of course, what was so shocking, this already at that stage, 2 years before 9/11, the West was clearly starting its propaganda operation to soften up the Western public for an invasion of some sort. In that, for example, you had the hysteria building up about the way that women are treated in Afghanistan. And of course, this is not a great thing, but in relation to the way the warlords had previously slaughtered and massacred people during the early 90s, the Taliban they came in on this kind of as I said, stability type of thing. And but yet were demonized by people like Christiane Amanpour. There was an incident where Christiane Amanpour, at least a year before 9/11, came to Kandahar with Emma Bonino, who was EU commissioner, liberal commissioner from Italy. And they set up this kind of stunt. I later heard that it was a stunt. But I heard about this before I ever went to Afghanistan, that they had been arrested by the Taliban, taken to jail, and they were outraged by this. And they had made themselves a small kind of press conference in front of their plane when they were finally due to depart. And when I went to Afghanistan a few years later, I learned that, in fact, what had actually happened was they were in a hospital in Kandahar, and the female head of the women's section asked them to stop filming, and they kept refusing to stop filming. So she called the head of the police, the Taliban head of police, and that was why they were arrested. But of course, none of that came out in the story that they put to the outside world about how appalling the Taliban's behavior was to them and to women in general. Of course, when I went to Afghanistan later on, after 9/11, I was working for the World Food Programme. I saw how press conferences were made every day in order to show the Western public how the US was delivering wheat to the Afghans to rescue them and to take care of them, meanwhile bombing their villages and killing sometimes whole villages of people in indiscriminate bombings. Then there was, of course, just prior to my first visit to Kabul, which was in early 2002, January, the Al Jazeera offices were bombed. I mean, Al Jazeera was still quite edgy at that time. It was a fairly new station, and I guess they were seen as a threat. I think they were also bombed in Iraq, so that was kind of a warning signal. Their building was completely sort of pancaked in Kabul. Other ways that the situation is manipulated in terms of manufacturing consent, manipulating the press. Of course, I mean, the overall theme is the use of women to soften up the Western public, to pull on the emotional strings of the Western public about how appallingly women were treated. But there was an utter failure to contextualize the situation into the different phases of the conflict that had gone before. And also, I mean, later on when I was in Kabul, I met women and I said, well, you must be quite happy to see these pictures of Masood up here on the lampposts. Of course, Masood was dead by that stage, but his people, the Northern Alliance, had now taken power with the assistance of the West, who'd bombed through the Taliban front lines. And they said, no, we're not happy at all. These people murdered us, they raped us, they cut off our breasts and committed massacres, tied people up to trees, did the most horrific things during the early 90s when there was this horrific civil war going on in Kabul. So that's overall the way. I mean, I still these days meet people who think it was all about democracy and women's rights. It's extraordinary. It's a complete infantilization of the Western public. The other way that journalists were softened up, I mean, a lot of journalists just hung around in Kabul and went to all the press conferences and didn't get out of Kabul. And so they were just spoon-fed the stories by the US military or the UN agencies or whoever wanted to manufacture a story. So, for example, I mean, when I was a freelance journalist, which I started doing in 2002, the Telegraph would call me and say, can you do a story on the women's driving or the women's beauty schools? And so I'd have to produce that story. And all the other papers were doing the same stories. You know, the New York Times was doing the same story, the Washington Post, the BBC, they were all doing the same stories, basically. So this was all part of building up a narrative for the public. Other ways that the journalists were controlled was, of course, through the use of embedding them with the US military and later on with NATO, because it was initially ISAF and NATO only came a bit later on, a couple of years into the conflict. So the journalists were embedded, which meant they traveled on missions with the military into the areas in the south, in Kandahar and so on. So, of course, they were completely reliant upon the military for their safety and security. And in fact, Tim Robbins, the actor, wrote a play about this. It was called Embed, which came out in about 2002 or 3, talking about the Stockholm syndrome that the journalists developed because they were not able to report freely the situation. Also, I had many stories spiked by the publications I was writing for, which was The Economist, The Telegraph, The Scotsman, because they didn't fit a narrative that they wanted to promote. For example, one of the occasions was I wanted to write about the UN had started a program to buy up and collect weapons to bring in the weapons from the warlords so that they could disarm them and start to try to create a central Afghan national army. But at the same time, you still had the US arming different warlords and factions in other parts of the country. But The Economist didn't want to print that because they didn't like the contradiction. Well, I thought it was a good point, but they obviously didn't. When later on, after I published my book, I had to self-publish it. I had many hurdles put in my way. And I was able, by really pushing, to get onto the Today program and the BBC occasionally. I was spiked a couple of times by people like Sherrod Cooper-Coles or Rory Stewart, who'd also written books. And of course, both of them we know now are linked with MI6. But other producers at the BBC Radio 4 Today program, I actually know a woman who was MI6, who then went to be a producer at the Today program. So this is very, very controlled. And prior to me doing an interview on what was going on in Afghanistan, and I did quite a few, but I'd always get drilled the day before by the producer. They always wanted to know exactly what points I was going to make. And if I came up with the wrong points, they would have someone else. They wouldn't have me on. So that's how they control. Other ways are, of course, the media would not report the story from the point of view of the groups that the West wasn't supporting. So that could be other Pashtun groups, it could be the Talibs, people who, for example, when I was doing my book, were involved with the King's Group, involved in trying to bring around a peace plan to reinstate the former king, who the Americans did not want on the scene because he would have generated his own circle of support. So the Northern Alliance and the memory of Massoud were lionized, and the Pashtun, not all of whom were associated with the Taliban. As I said, many wanted to topple them through this internal indigenous peace plan. They were basically cast aside. They weren't even allowed to go to the Bonn meeting. Many of the influential members of that tribe were not allowed to go to set the stage for what was going to come or meant to come as the new so-called democratic Afghanistan. So those are just really some examples. I mean, obviously the war was sold as being about democracy, being about women's rights, being about human rights. And meantime, at the same time, we were ignoring stories of massacres by some of the warlords that the West was supporting, such as in Mazar-e-Sharif, Dostum and Malek, who were just killing whole container loads of Pashtun guys who they'd rounded up previously in the war and just burying them in the desert. Those stories were glossed over. They were the scenes of these massacres were not protected, so they couldn't be properly investigated. The UN didn't protect those scenes of those massacres. So it was all extremely one-sided and hypocritical, and not, as I say, about human rights at all. And just circling back to Ukraine, I saw Patrick Lancaster on the Judging Freedom show on YouTube today. I think he was on a couple of days ago. And he was talking about how he can no longer sell his footage to the mainstream for use because they spin it in a way that he doesn't, it just manipulates the story. So he says he's now crowdfunded because that way he gets to keep control of the story. And for that reason, that was also why I self-published my book, because there were some publishers interested, but one of them, it was the daughter of Sherrod Cooper-Coles, former UK ambassador, who was going to be the editor. So I just pulled out of that and did it myself so I could keep control. But yes, I mean, Patrick Lancaster, what he was saying about his footage, and also what he said is to encourage the public to try to look at both sides of the story, to research for themselves, so that you can start to compare and contrast. And that is more easy these days than it was 20 years ago when I was first in Afghanistan. And obviously so many online, Substack and so on. But yes, the fact that the public's being kept in the dark on Ukraine in the way that they were kept in the dark on Afghanistan, I think this time the blowback is going to be so much worse for the West, for Europe, for the UK. I think when the public finds out that thus far, it's something like 400,000 Ukrainian young men who have just been slaughtered in this mass murder of them, thanks to the British and Western weapons that are being funneled into that country. I think there's going to be a huge amount of anger. And of course, it's going to blow back onto the UK with the inflation, the bifurcation of the international system, the rise of the BRICS, and the deindustrialization of Western Europe, which I think is going to put us into a massive recession. So, yeah, those are just some of my initial points. I have a lot more to say.
No, I think the last point you made is very important, that there's a tremendous amount of political capital that has been wagered by Western governments, by leaders, and then they're really doubling down on that, despite the fact that what's happening on the ground is completely diametrically opposed to the narratives that are being pushed through the media, and really they're pushing them to each other. It's the most extraordinary thing. And just back to your comment on Afghanistan, that was marketed as the first feminist war, you could say. Certainly Amnesty International, NATO, and everybody was marketing it that way. But the parallels, what you said is, the massacres that were going on at the hands of the U.S. allies, the Northern Alliance, people being, tortured in public, taped to trees and things like that. We're seeing the same thing in Ukraine with people who are suspected of being Russian collaborators, being cling filmed to polls, hazing, torture, and also the kind of obfuscation of the rampant Nazism on the Ukrainian side. And this is constantly being downplayed. It reminded me of what you were saying about Afghanistan. Systematically, it's being downplayed in all sorts of different ways, and they're trying to say, well, this is a Russian conspiracy theory, that there's a huge Nazi element that's dominant, and you could say. And actually, the facts are very clear. There is, and has been for some time, and even the BBC itself reported on this with major documentary reports before the Maidan and after the Maidan. And this is, so it's interesting. Can you comment on that aspect?
Yeah, I think the failure, as you said earlier, Patrick, the fact that they're all singing from the same song sheet at the same time with their little sound bites like unprovoked aggression or, Russia's aggression and so on, but yet they utterly failed to talk about the Maidan coup and the Minsk process, and how the Russians were misled, and how there wasn't really any desire to make an honest go of trying to bring about peace. So they obviously behind the scenes always preparing for war, and so yes, they just completely excise really important parts of the story from the public. They just don't put them in the press.
Yeah, it's extraordinary, and it's unprecedented on a scale that I've never seen, and no one else has ever seen before. We'll come back for some little bit of a question session later, but thank you, Dr. Lucy Morgan Edwards, much appreciated. And I want to bring onto the panel independent journalist from France. He's also a contributor at 21st Century Wire, someone I've worked with over the last couple of years. His name is Freddie Ponton. Freddie, thank you very much for joining us on this program this evening.
Well, it's a pleasure being here. Thank you very much, and I'll take this opportunity to salute my colleagues here in this panel. It's very interesting discussions here. I'm very impressed by the quality of the panel, and I hope to be able to bring some perhaps some different insight into this propaganda machine that is NATO. So yes, I'm glad to be here today, Patrick.
And so, what are your thoughts on this topic generally, Freddie? Propaganda there's different types of propaganda. We have the 1.0 propaganda, straight control of the mainstream, which Lucy has discussed as well. Peter's also alluded to this with Iraq. Just your thoughts on this, and has it been updated? What are some of the new developments?
Well, you have the privilege to know my work, since I'm a contributor to the 21st Century Wire. So you do get to see my article and my investigations, and perhaps one of the major investigations which have really exposed NATO principles and the way NATO is actually hiding pretty much everything that it does. And although they present themselves as an organization that is extremely transparent, the reality is far from it. I mean, we saw for the Nord Streams a lot of stories were planted to try to explain this sabotage, which make everybody's kind of pretty get a good idea who did it. But it seems that NATO's and governments alike in NATO member states are very happy to push a different kind of unbelievable story, exotic stories. You know, in March, for example, they reported a pro-Ukraine group which was involved or allegedly involved in the sabotage. You know, so German media started to report that 5 men and a woman used a yacht hired by Ukrainian-owned company in Poland. I mean, can you imagine? You're already in 3-4 different countries. How do they expect people to believe this nonsense? You know, and we have to believe that these guys were hiring a vessel from Germany, from the port of Rostock. I mean, this is the kind of thing for Hollywood, you know, but nobody really believed in that at all. And we have the German federal prosecutors at the time declining any comments. There was this huge report, including the story exposing the CIA, warning NATO allies, at least one of the NATO allies, that there was a possible plot to sabotage the Nord Stream pipeline. But no, nothing is even close to the truth. And I revealed that in my investigation, at least in part 1 and part 2. And I can tell you part 3 is going to be a shocker for a lot of people, because we're going to really actually be able to put some names on certain of the individuals and organizations that were actually taking part in organizing this sabotage. So you can forget about Ukraine, you can forget about Poland and Germany. You know, we're going to go somewhere else. So that's really, for me, just one of the many examples that I could outline today that expose really NATO as a fabricator of stories, if you will, to cover up the defeat, and not only on the battleground, not on the battlefield, but also in the information warfare. They're losing everywhere, and I think today we can all agree that disinformation is not new. I mean, for centuries, state and non-state actors have weaponized information for political or military gain, you know. So what has changed, I would say, is the sheer scale of complexities of today's information technology. Now, the information landscape is very complex, and it has indeed never been easier for disinformation or propaganda to spread through our society. Now, this has been increasingly facilitated by our mainstream media. Let's not forget that they've been very complicit in pushing agendas, political agendas or propaganda, and we saw that very in great extent during the COVID-19 response. You know, I think a lot of misinformation and disinformation actually was pushed on national television. So for those that get the information, their truth from this kind of network or platforms, there was only one narrative for them, and there was no possibility to fight back, or at least even to possibly, you know, argue the mainstream narrative. So that's a very worrying. And of course, we can see that now these platforms have taken a major stake in the information battlefield. And they do represent a threat for NATO and the EU, as they keep on basically opening a dialogue, a debate where we can expose their proxy war in Ukraine, or perhaps even their complete silence over the Nord Stream pipelines, and the complete blackout of their shady activities in Syria or in Libya or in Iraq, So the game has changed, if you will, and I think we clearly see some desperations. We can see that NATO organization, institution like the EU cannot afford to lose a proxy war in the backyard of Europe, as well as losing basically the information war. So yes, Patrick, the art of manipulation was not invented yesterday, and nor was I born yesterday, So it would be very naive for us to believe that people in powers have not developed means and techniques to influence their populations, which they've used and likely abused for centuries. So why should it be any different today? So NATO and EU are telling us that we and they are both victims of disinformation and manipulation and propaganda. That's what they're telling us. But these threats are present, according to them, in social media feeds, and usually without even our awareness, us being aware of it. And they blame these hybrid threats for influencing the media and academia as well, the science. So their adversaries, which end up to become our adversaries, is said to be using hybrid methods to make us feel unsafe, make it hard for us to actually distinguish the truth from lies. And of course, this automatically erode our trust in our leaders, in our government, and that's something they cannot afford. So if you listen to those who actually works at the heart of NATO counter-disinformation effort, because there is a NATO counter-disinformation effort, someone like David Kattler, the Assistant Secretary General for Intelligence and Security at NATO, you get a very, very strange feeling that something is not quite right. So first of all, I don't know you, but I found it's quite ironical, perhaps even funny, that the intelligence community, these masters in deceptions and propaganda, are the very same people who claim to protect you and I from disinformation. That's just very, very bizarre. And perhaps I think we should expand the DURC, what is known as the DIRC terminology, to the information warfare. DIRC is the dual use of research of concern. This is basically an experiment conducted with two anticipated outcome, and that very notions of dual use is very present in the intelligence community, and we can feel it when you start to investigate disinformation and misinformation. You can see that everything is being weaponized, and the very same people that blame the others are the people actually weaponizing the informations and issuing the propaganda. So I have to be very cautious about who's the victim and who's not. Now, perhaps we also look at defining these hybrid threats. These are combined military and non-military, as well as covert and overt means. This is how, and the techniques that are used today to manipulate the informations or manipulate the perceptions that we are getting via different means, whether it's social media or via mainstream media. Sorry, it's Basil. And so, yes, I think if you listen to someone like David Kattler at NATO, he described these hybrid activities, including disinformation and propaganda, as something that is often used by adversaries because these adversaries realize that they cannot prevail in a conventional conflict with NATO, or more broadly, they cannot prevail with the West or even compete politically, militarily, or economically with NATO and the West. So that is the doctrine, if you will. This is what they believe. People are using propaganda. It's simply because they cannot get back at the West. Now, it's quite an incredible assertion, of course, to make, especially when looking at Russia, for example. I mean, if that was any close to the truth, after all the economic sanctions and the money Russia has allocated towards their military special operation in Ukraine, we should have by now seen Russia surrendering to NATO or to Ukraine. We should see Russia on its knees, begging for food. We should see the ruble, the Russian currency, hitting rock bottoms, or the Russian economy completely out of business. And we should certainly see Russia in a diplomatic cul-de-sac. And more importantly, we should see Russia losing the NATO proxy war in Ukraine. And yet, none of that has happened. So is it possible that they've actually got that wrong? Is it possible that this doctrine, this technocratic doctrine that seems to have crippled, or that seems to have found its way in many of this administration and institution, might be simply based on untruth, on things that actually are not true? Now, we know that Russia has offered on several occasions Ukraine to come to the negotiation table. They wanted to find a peace agreement, a way to get out, to avoid basically the loss of life. And that was at the very early hours of the conflicts. It was an effort which was eventually, as we know, rewarded after the discussion in Turkey, which was facilitated by Erdogan. So unfortunately for the people of Ukraine, these efforts were very much undermined very quickly and cancelled by first Boris Johnson and eventually, Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, who clearly do not like the prospect of peace. So it seems that these very people that are warning us about disinformations are not very much keen in promoting peace. And that's very concerning for someone that lives in the European Union, and that should be, of course, a great concern for anyone around the world. Now, have the European Union and have NATO ever challenged Vladimir Putin's statements regarding the declaration he made during the South African delegation visit to Russia, where he actually pulled out the document outlining the conditions related to a ceasefire, a peace agreement, which was basically signed by the Ukrainian government, So have we seen NATO or the European Union brought proof to the contrary that this never happened? No. So again, Russia has been accused of every single crime you can probably find. But the conclusion here is that Russia is definitely competing politically. Russia is competing militarily, and Russia is competing economically. So that's definitely directly in opposition to what NATO is telling us about how and why these countries, whether it's China, whether it's Iran, whether it's Syria, whether it's Russia, why are they actually basically allegedly using hybrid threats such as disinformation to trying to manipulate the people of the European blocs and beyond. So that's really something for me that is very important to understand, is that what's going on, what are the doctrines that are taught in these institutions, and how they actually reflect in the reality. If you look at the success, for example, of the recent BRICS summit in Johannesburg, in South Africa. Now, how can one describe Russia as an adversary that cannot compete on all these fronts? I mean, clearly, it's simply absurd. And yes, it is the technocratic school of thought that you can find in NATO. So we must question as who's the victim and who is the perpetrators. We need to really be aware of that and really understand actually what is at play here. Now, how does NATO analyze this threat? How do they actually come to this conclusion? Now, first they identify, they analyze, and of course they counter counter disinformation, we know that NATO works with the European Union, for example, through the European External Action Service. They work extensively with them and the European Commission. They also work with the G7 Rapid Response Mechanism. They work for the United Nations and their verified campaign, you know. And I heard a doctor saying earlier that she also worked with the World Food Program, and I was a contractor myself for the World Food Program, so I have a pretty good idea of how these guys function. And I won't say more than that, but clearly we can see that the partners of choice for NATO's are very ambiguous, to say the least. And we know that the US State Department Global Engagement Center is also involved in this disinformation, counter-disinformation campaign as well, coming out of NATO. So there's a lot of political attach. A lot of global institutions are involved in that. And it's not a surprise that they are pushing a narrative, and they want to make sure that this main narrative is accepted. And if you don't accept it, they will push it down your throat, that you can rest assured of. Now, for the historical background on how that happened, especially in Europe, it's important to understand that the first joint declaration was signed in Poland, in Warsaw, in July 2016. This is when NATO and the EU identified seven concrete areas for enhancing cooperation between both of these organizations. And guess what? On the top of the list, it was the countering of hybrid threats, which basically fall under the disinformation, propaganda, and disinformation. So clearly, this is on top of their priority. And they studied that in 2016, and it really took shape in 2019 when we entered this COVID-19 so-called pandemic. So we can clearly see that for over a period of 3 years, they've worked together to plan, really to plan their actions and how they will manage information. They will manage it for you, of course. So that's very interesting to have this kind of a timeline to see when these guys came together and how they started to get organized. Now, another contributors to this disinformation effort coming out of NATO and EU is Baiba Brazi. She's the NATO Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy. And if you look at how and the way she describes the threat of disinformation and how she explains NATO response, it is quite a learning curve, to be honest, to say the least. And thanks God we don't have to agree with her, at least not yet. So how does NATO respond to disinformation? If you listen to this lady, she will explain to you that NATO counter disinformation is actually fact-based. It is a credible public communication. They are transparent, and they have publicly outlined their approach to countering disinformation. So this all been made public, and you shouldn't doubt their good intention. So they say their work involves understanding and analyzing the information environment and engaging the audience to build resilience. And the word resilience is a real key word that everybody should pay attention to. When you see the word resilience in any of these guys or what they're doing, you need to know this is part of an agenda. This is part of a concept. This is a major umbrella under which emergency and crisis will be handled with. We know that these governments, they know they're illegitimate for most of them. They barely can get any support, from a major populist movement across Europe and even in the United States. We can see Macron, if he can barely put together 25% of people supporting his foreign policies or even his domestic policies, he'll be very lucky. So these people, they don't rule really because they have the support from population. They rule because they use emergency power. And that's what resilience is all about. It's about the ability to invoke emergency power and therefore the continuity of government in order to impose your narrative, your views, and the reason why you are going after people's freedom, after the people's freedom of speech. So that's what I would like to share today, because it's very important. And of course, this dialogue and this entire observation is there to demonstrate how NATO and EU intend to vaccinate the global social media population to stop them from developing a strong immune response against government institutional propaganda. So that's what we are fighting against right now at this moment, is that they're going to try to cancel our right to an alternative opinion, an alternative view. And that obviously leads me to refer to the DSA, the Digital Service Acts, which we'll talk about it.
Yeah, well, which we had more time to delve into the EU Digital Services Act, which is a new issue now that we have to face. We'll try. We have a couple of minutes to talk about a couple of these things with each of the speakers in the remaining time. But one thing I just wanted to comment on what Freddie's just laid out there. This need for full spectrum dominance, not only to control the propaganda, as Freddie was saying, but also to control the speech, to censor under the guise of protecting the public against so-called, foreign disinformation. What this has done, this full spectrum dominance, it is going to backfire and is backfiring, because by snuffing out all alternative narratives, opinions, and information, it raids in terms of managing expectations. They've gone way over the top, to the point where the bar which they've set for this narrative is so completely high, and the reality on the ground is so completely different, that there's this massive chasm between the two. And this is when people are really waking up and seeing what an absolute fraud this narrative management and propaganda and information warfare exercise has become. It's becoming an absolute farce. So these tools they have, these incredible tools they have, well, they come with a huge potential backlash at the same time. They're making it up as they go along. This is uncharted territory for them as well as us. I want to bring back each of our speakers for a final comment. First, Peter Ford. If we bring Peter back to the stage. Peter, based on what you've heard from the speakers, and also any other areas of discussion on this, comment on this that you'd like to contribute here, go ahead.
Yeah, listening to the other speakers, what strikes me is that we're in a propaganda war, not just about Ukraine. It's a world propaganda war, which has been spawned out of the Ukraine conflict. It's now crossed the borders worldwide. Many countries have been affected by the sanctions on Russia. Many countries have resisted being corralled into the Western camp and refused to ostracize Russia. So we now see the campaign being extended, Western campaign being extended to the BRICS. There's been a cacophony of orchestrated negative comments about the BRICS. Now, the new enemy that's emerging, because they won't kowtow, they won't go along with the anti-Russian, anti-Chinese narrative. But the BRICS themselves are not having it. In fact, they're going the opposite way. Saudi Arabia is now off the reservation. They're doing deals with China. They are having a détente with Iran. In fact, I think the Saudis have realized that the Americans were fitting them up to play the role of Ukraine again in the conflict that the Americans wanted to see with Iran. They were going to be part of that meat grinder. Well, they're not having it, and they have an alternative. And then finally, in the background, you have the undeclared war against China. Again, the propaganda is reaching crescendo. China is not playing the game over Ukraine. This is a world propaganda war now.
Very good point, Peter. And this as well, the censorship is also a global censorship, with the amount of power in the Silicon Valley working with U.S. government agencies has been exposed. It affects everybody worldwide, every election, every bit of political comment on Facebook, on Twitter, on LinkedIn Google, YouTube, etc. It is extraordinary. So people need to really take this very seriously. We're in an interesting point in civilization. Thank you, Peter Ford. I want to bring back Dr. Lucy Morgan Edwards as well. And Lucy, I didn't get it. We didn't talk much about the theatrics of it, but we have a few minutes left. I want to get your final comments, and also, what are your thoughts on the character of Zelensky in this Ukrainian story? Because it is quite an incredible theatrical phenomenon, let's say, to go along with the proxy war. But you go ahead, Lucy.
It's incredible how the Western public has bought into the myth of Zelensky. I mean, who was it that said recently that he was it George Bush who said that he was one of the greatest leaders since Winston Churchill? It's just thoroughly ridiculous. I mean, the guy is an actor. He's a clown. He's a very well-paid actor, basically. I was listening to Alistair Crook, who's apparently got a piece out recently. For some reason, I'm not able to access Strategic Culture at the moment. I hope that hasn't been censored, but because that's where he normally produces his pieces. But he was talking about how Zelensky is between a rock and a hard place. He's between the military, who are not going to want to continue fighting, particularly as the weapons run out and the support dries up from the EU, because I think the EU's is it von der Leyen has asked for 89 billion euros, and Biden's asking for another 49 billion US dollars to send to Ukraine, and it's just not going to be, well, at least the EU, I don't think is going to be able to stump up that kind of cash, and the states is saying no, we don't have that sort of money. Whether or not the US can, it's all debt based, of course, and the wars are now apparently in the realm of $16 trillion or something. I mean, it was 8 trillion for Afghanistan and Iraq, and now the costs for the Ukraine war added to that has miraculously sort of doubled, and it's all based, of course, on this fiat printed money. So how long they can keep spinning plates and keep all this in the air is anyone's guess. What you said, Patrick, about the NATO full spectrum propaganda war, and what Freddie mentioned about the techniques that they're using, which I'm not so familiar with. I'm going to look up a couple of these people that he's mentioned. But I did know a few of the public affairs officers in Afghanistan. This was something they were starting to ramp up in Afghanistan, and they took some of the former freelance journalists or poached journalists from other places and use these people to pump out the NATO line at press conferences. And I had to sit in on a lot of meetings with NATO and with the US military, and of course the UN and so on. And I started to feel that they seem to inhabit their own universe, and the kind of talking points that they would be pumping out was so divorced from what ordinary Afghans were feeling, particularly once you went outside of Kabul and into the regions. And you really heard people saying, if this is what your democracy means, i.e. all of this corruption, which we're experiencing from all the money that was flooding in, we don't want it. We'd rather live by our own means, through our own systems of governance, informal governance, and so on. But I still find when I go onto my LinkedIn page or go to meetings in Geneva, I live in Geneva amongst all these UN bureaucrats and so on, they still seem to inhabit a world which is under a bell jar in terms of spouting stuff about climate emergency and Ukraine being the aggrieved party, and not seeing the bigger picture that 400,000 young men are dead for what? And this is going to continue, because it's my belief that the people running this, they somehow feel that this is that they can bleed Russia like they bled the Soviet Union during the 1980s, and that somehow is miraculously going to lead to the collapse of Russia and the regime of Vladimir Putin. But of course, Russia is a very, very different place, and the opposite is going to be the case. It's going to be the EU that's going to collapse first, I believe, and at that stage, maybe these people will wake up. but they do seem to talk a different language, and in that respect, I think you're right. I think they will overreach, and the ordinary people will just say this is totally ridiculous, and you can't clamp down on us like this.
Indeed. Thank you, Dr. Lucy Morgan Edwards. Yes, we're fast approaching that event horizon of the ultimate farce, where people are going to really lose faith in some of these highly esteemed institutions, media institutions, and these government officials. It's just not credible. It's just not believable. But got a few minutes left, and then we're going to wrap up this meeting. I want to bring Freddie Ponton back for a final comment. Freddie, and just, I know you mentioned the European Digital Services Act, and I'll give you the floor for the final couple of minutes, but it does remind me of the new NATO doctrine, which was also announced by the head of the British Armed Forces a few years ago, that there is no more war and there is no peacetime. There is only a constant spectrum. And this is the new 5th generation warfare doctrine. Everything is weaponized, every bit in the information space. This is what the United States has adopted for election integrity, that Twitter is part of the election infrastructure, Facebook, same, so that they're policing this. Any disinformation is deemed as a national security threat to elections. This is what they're saying in the United States. So the same in Europe, the same with NATO. Just a spectrum, no peacetime, no wartime, constantly. It's almost Orwellian. I admit it's Orwellian. But on that note, Freddie, your final thoughts.
Yeah, I think, Patrick, it is quite clear that the gap is widening in between those in power, those oligarchs, and the common people, those that are paying taxes and that are asking for accountability. And I think that's really the major the major point we can all, as journalists, we can all see is that this lack of accountability, this lack of transparency is really hurting. It's hurting the institution. It is really hurting the trust in our institutions, and people more and more are looking for alternatives. And that is the reason why this BRICS Plus now has getting so much traction, around the world. There are countries, lining up to get into these BRICS. And I don't see many countries lining up to be part of NATO, and I don't see any valid reason for them to line up to be a member of NATO. I mean, they try to sell the idea of maybe Japan and other countries outside of Europe to become members of NATO, but this is an agenda. Nobody wants to get dragged into a war on the other side of the world just to please NATO. So we are living a very interesting time, because clearly, obviously, this multi-polar world is going to create opportunities also for us to fight back, and it's going to be harder and harder for these organizations to rely on the suppression, the censorship, and the sanctions to impose their will. For me, the way I feel right now is that NATO, and mainly an extensions of the United States foreign policy, is willing to really keep Europe for itself. They don't want Europe to have an open window into the BRICS. And if we really, like government do, which is look into the long terms, surely we must see some very important geopolitical opportunities that's going to be open with this BRICS Plus. If you look at Saudi Arabia and Iran coming together, I mean, what are the odds? If you should have said me that 3 years ago, I would have told you to go away. No way. And yet again, this has been possible and made possible. So clearly there is a need for stability. I think people want peace. People want to live in a world where we can trade without being bullied. We can choose the currency in which we want to trade. And we're going to see some strategy countries like Israel, for example, being pushed to revisit their alliance with the United States, because where they are in the world, and how important would that be for the Palestinian crisis? Perhaps an opportunity to eventually solve a problem in Israel and Palestine. So that's something to look forward to. And then perhaps in the long term, it will be interesting to see which first European nation will defect from this NATO and from these alliances, to finally rejoin the BRICS family, seeing something that they relate more as far as trading, as far as cultural, as far as, being part of something simply greater and perhaps more genuine. So a lot of things is awaiting us. There's a lot of hope in the air. And I'm very glad to see that BRICS has chosen the road of stability and the logistic roads to make sure that this part of the world is controlled by people that are stable, that are rational, and that makes sense. So I'm delighted to see the way things are going, and we unfortunately have to see how NATO will extract itself from this debacle in Ukraine, and how around the corner from a US election, they will be able to explain themselves after the debacle of Afghanistan. And I'm not sure politically the Biden administration is going to survive another kind of debacle out of Ukraine. Too much money, too much lives have been consumed, and these people needs to be held accountable. And I hope the social media platform, the work we do, the work you do, Patrick, is going to help towards achieving this goal.
Yeah, and don't forget about the Obama-Biden debacle in Libya as well. Another one in NATO's trophy case, as well as Sarkozy's. But I think the other, to final round off your point, Freddie, which is really important, the NATO has become a political organization. It's gone from being ostensibly a military alliance to really a political organization, really concerned with censorship, concerned with the information war space. And they're pushing a lot of these policies on Europe from the United States, from the Pentagon. NATO is the glove in which the US can insert its hand to steer European economic, political, and geopolitical affairs. So who will be the first to jump ship? France's relationship with NATO has always been a little bit precarious. We just got a minute left, Freddie. We're a little bit over time, but give us your final thought on that.
Yeah, I would say that, yeah, I mean, just to come back to France's relationship with NATO, we've always been the troublemaker. We've been kind of the protesters within NATO from day one. We've never been really kind of having a happy relationship with Washington. Let's be clear about that. But a lot of people and a lot of geopoliticians have put a lot of focus on this forbidden relationship between Russia and Germany, always with these, Nicholas Spykman and Alfred McKinder, all these guys, still doctrines are very much alive today within NATO. And that's really interesting to see how they've forgotten actually this very special relationship that at the end of the war and back in the 80s and 90s, France was building again this relationship with Germany to the point that we were about to actually build our own European defense, the Eurocorps, as it was called. And during a meeting, actually, in La Rochelle, a little town in southwest of the Atlantic front of France, we were actually entertaining the possibility of moving away from NATO, and we were able to actually entertain the self-determination, the possibility to create our own European defense capabilities outside of NATO. Well, that was turned on very quickly, and we felt the full fledged of the American weight. They've been a troublemaker in Europe since the end of the Second World War, and we are paying a heavy price until today. And this needs to stop. America needs to go home and care about their own people and the domestic issues and their borders and so on and so forth. But they need to get out of Europe. We're done with them.
Thank you very much, Freddie Ponton, independent journalist. You can look at Freddie's work. He has an extensive archive at 21st Century Wire, articles, research, open source research, as well as interviews on this and other topics. And I want to thank our other panelists as well, Ambassador Peter Ford and also Dr. Lucy Morgan Edwards. I encourage you to follow all of our speakers at their various venues where they are speaking. Of course, No2Nato, No2War is one of those venues, not just here online for the virtual meetings, which are very important. This is, I believe, the 8th in this series, but also the live events where we're talking to you to people in real life, either in central London or in other venues around Britain, but also sister organizations like this in the United States too. So I know our audience is international. So the intention here with this forum is to inform, to enlighten, but also to raise political awareness of everybody watching, to understand the really important aspects of these really important issues, to see the patterns over time, and to see and somewhat be able to predict where these things are heading, where these situations are heading, like Ukraine. And if you have a back knowledge of the previous conflicts, and thank you to our speakers for sharing their experience, Peter Ford with Syria, Lucy Morgan Edwards with Afghanistan, and Freddie with his broad knowledge of a lot of these different incidents, conflicts, and also the political history of Europe. From that, you'll be able to hopefully be able to analyze and evaluate what's going on today, and understand if the policies that are being laid out by our political leaders, many of them unelected, whether these are going to hit the wall or not. And I think with Ukraine, it's safe to say now it's been 18 months, and this situation has absolutely hit the wall. And when Jan Stoltenberg, and I'll leave you this final thought, when Jan Stoltenberg, the Secretary of General of NATO, says, and this has to do with propaganda, when he says, and Ursula von der Leyen and Joe Biden, and they say, NATO has never been more united than it has now, and we can thank the Russians for bringing it together. When you hear them say that they've never been more united, you know that they have never been more potentially disunited. And NATO is staring into the abyss right now because this situation has gone so horribly wrong, and the miscalculation is on a biblical level, and we're seeing the results of this now. Everybody is realizing this. This can't be hidden now. And so this is going to be a very interesting fall and winter. And I can speak only for myself, but I believe my colleagues also agree that we would all like to see this conflict come to an abrupt end, and people negotiate, that Ukraine and the West can sue for peace, that Russia can come to the table with the West or without the West, but with Ukraine, and bring this conflict to an end, this senseless loss of life. This could have been avoided. This could have been avoided a long time ago, but here we are. Thank you very much for joining us, everybody watching. We really appreciate it. Please like, share, and follow No2Nato, No to War on X, Twitter, and all the Telegram as well, YouTube, and all the other venues you'll find our content. But thank you very much, and good night.